those for as long as I can remember. Both sets of grandparents came from Eastern Europe. I had one grandfather that could talk about life under the Tsar Nicholas of Russia. I had another grandfather that could talk about life under Franz Joseph II of Austria-Hungary. So, talk about living history books, it doesn't get much better than that. My father was a World War II Navy vet, and then he also loved history, so we had history books galore. And as far as nature and the environment, my father was a nature-loving farm boy, and he had a special interest in edible wild plants. He actually gave presentations in that, and trees. Now, I went along with him for a lot of mushroom expeditions. I have picked a few myself and survived. But as far as trees were concerned, I definitely bonded with him as far as trees go. And so that's been something that I've been immersed in, from a kid, right up until the present day. But combining the environment and nature with history, didn't start automatically. And I wanted to share, there's actually 3 things that happened that were kind of revelations, epiphanies of sorts. So one of them involved trying to figure out what an African-American burial ground was doing in the middle of a state forest in the town of Owego. And that open house that they have for the Historical Society, they just were able to expand their space. So now they've actually got room where they can display it, which they couldn't before. But that same day in the morning, I'll be taking another hike out to the burial ground for anybody that's interested. I've been doing. There were African Americans on this farm in the 1870s, and that's very likely where, if there are any burials there, I don't have any written proof, unfortunately. But in the process of doing that, going through the census books, I got all this information about the status of the farm, and I'm reading these statistics. And he had 200 acres of improved land, he had 40 sheep, he had a dozen milk cows, he produced 6,000 pounds of butter, 40 acres of wheat, 200 apple trees. So if I could have gone into a time machine, I would have been in the middle of a thriving agricultural operation, and now I'm in the middle of the woods. So I started to think, boy, something happened that I'm not aware of. That just piqued my curiosity. So the other area was when we were doing, I was the project director for the Herrick Barn project, which is a English threshing barn at the Newark Valley Billings Farmstead. And this is one that actually came from the town of Candor, and it was disassembled, and we re-erected it. And then I was we replaced a lot of the timbers that need to be, redone, and the frame was entirely hand hewn. So I started, kind of looking at the timbers and wondering, well, when they built this barn, they just went into their backyard, and they got these trees, from which they could cut out beams that were 30, 40 feet long. They probably could have made them even longer. And they're carving out, a 9x12 or thereabouts. So, what was the forest like 200 years ago when they built this barn? And there was one barn in particular that was from the a little bit earlier period. There were 30-foot beams, and they were like 9x12. I mean, if you're a woodworker, this is the type of thing that makes you drool. And there was bark at both ends of the beam. So I'm thinking, how tall was this tree, and what kind of a taper did it have that you could take 30 feet out of it, and there's bark at both ends of it? So once again, my imagination just kind of took off. And then the third thing that happened, which really put me, on this, natural history track, was, Ron and I were actually talking about it, earlier, was Seasons of Change, and that was Tioga County's bicentennial history. Tioga County was formed in 1791, so there's a group of us that wrote a history of the, kind of like the 20th century, basically. My area was ethnic immigrant minority groups, and one of the reasons I did that is I wanted to have a better idea of what brought my Polish grandparents to Newark Valley in 1921. You know, here they are from another part of the world, and then it wasn't just my Polish grandparents. There was quite a group that settled in Gander, along with Russians and Ukrainians. There were Swiss, there were Finns, so on and so forth. So I speculated that I could get information from the local newspapers besides oral history. So I started looking through some of the papers from the early 1920s, and I'm coming across all kinds of other items that are just really fascinating. So I'm supposed to be working on one thing, and says, boy, I got 6 different directions I could go in. But for those of you that do historical research, you know how that goes. So I came across this one article that definitely piqued my curiosity. This is on the front page. An unknown hunter shoots a deer in Owego. So that was my reaction to it. This must have been a slow news week to put this on the front page of the paper. So I went through and they gave a description of where this deer was shot. It was on McLean Hill on the John Holden farm. And they just said, to shoot a deer out of season is a misdemeanor, punishable by a fine or imprisonment. And it says, a man who will shoot a female deer besides. So that was like, this is 3 strikes and you're out automatically. A man who would shoot a female deer is considered a mighty reprehensible citizen. The young doe is one of the most innocent creatures in the world. Most folks would about soon shoot a baby. I mean, it's one of the interesting things about the newspapers in that period. They didn't pull any punches here. Whereas they wanted to let people know exactly how they felt and the populace. So they went on saying about the Tioga County Sportsmen Association was upset, and so on and so forth. And then, now this paragraph was interesting. It said, Tioga County people generally are much elated over the fact that wild deer have worked back within her borders. It is a shame that anything should be done to stop the return of the deer or diminish the natural increase now that they are breeding in this locality. So that doesn't show a lot of ecological intelligence, to make a statement like that. And within about 10 years, public opinion would start to change. So where do we start? So as far as the environment is concerned, we can go all the way back to the Big Bang, but since we want to get out of here before midnight, we'll skip a few billion years. 10,000, 12,000 years ago, there was a mile of ice, where we're standing, where we're here tonight. And then the climate warms, the ice melts, and one of the things that I found out that sea level, the amount of ice on the Earth makes a big difference. Sea level was 350 feet lower than it is today, if you go back to the glacier period. It wasn't the Hudson River, it was the Hudson Ravine. So, but then this whole process of succession takes place, and you can actually experience this if you want to. If you go up to the Arctic, and then start working your way south, you go through the tundra, and then you go to the taiga, which has, more woody plants, maybe a few trees, then the boreal forest. And then when you get to this locality, what eventually happens is that we have eastern mixed woodlands. That's the type of environment that's here. And the mixed part comes from eastern white pine and eastern hemlock. Eastern white pine in particular, that's one of the most important woods in Western civilization. But those are the only 2 conifers that were native to the southern tier. Anything else that you see, the red pine, the cedar, those have all been brought in. Those are referred to as exotics, or if they don't behave themselves, we call them invasives. And so when I was, first trying to piece together what went on in, what the environment might have been like here, say at least in the 1700s. I went through all of the histories that were written of Tioga County, which date from like the 1870s, 1880s. And what they said about the environment was just very minimal. You know, the trees were tall, it was a dark impenetrable forest, and then the phrase which actually expressed, you know, how people viewed the forest was, "Soon the settler's axe would bring the light of civilization to the forest floor." And basically, the forest was the enemy, and you had to get rid of the trees, you know, to produce, you know, crops for agriculture, for settlement. Now, you really didn't have to clear cut, but the mentality was chop everything down. One of the big cash crops for New York State in those early years was potash. Cut the trees down, burn them up, and it was one of the things that fueled the Industrial Revolution. But one thing that was mentioned, and they specifically mentioned candor, was that they were white pine, 5 feet in diameter, 175 feet high. So that's the height of a 17-story building. And there were millions of white pine like that. White pine stretched from Maine all the way to Minnesota. And so that quality of timber, that's what you saw, you know, all the way through the southern tier, you know, New York State, and all the way across that northern stretch. Now, one thing I want to mention is that one of the justifications for taking land from the natives was that they aren't doing anything with the acreage. It's just forest, it's just trees, it's just sitting there. You got to put it to productive use. But for Native Americans, I mean, this was their breadbasket. I mean, just about everything that they needed, you know, their shelter, their food, their medicinal plants, their gardens, you know, came from the forest. So they had a much different view. And they didn't just let Mother Nature hand them the forest, and they took what they needed from that. They were much smarter than that. I kind of refer to them as our first foresters, because this is the way, what things that they did to enhance what they could, you know, acquire from the woods. Now, it's an area that I want to explore a little bit, you know, much more than I have already, but one of the areas was the use of fire. I mean, right from the 1600s, when the ships were coming in, either in the spring or the fall, they would mention that the natives had set the woods ablaze. Now, these were fires that they burned on a regular basis, so they weren't these big conflagrations, and they did it, you know, every few years, and so the benefits were immense. It returned nutrients to the ground much faster. It got rid of a lot of diseases, a lot of pathogens. Open areas would stay open, grass would grow, and guess what? It attracted white-tailed deer, making it easier to hunt. And then it was also easier to move around in the woods. You'd create less noise, which also made it easier to hunt white-tailed deer. So I just came across an article. This was evidently, the natives across North America did this. There's a group of natives that are near or within a national forest in California, and they're finally working with the native peoples to create, you know, burns so that they can kind of duplicate what they had, you know, originally. But that was not the viewpoint. I mean, one of the things that I read in delving into environmental history, and I went back looking at ancient Greece and ancient Rome, and people were saying, you know, I think we made a mistake cutting all those trees down because the soil washed away, and now we're kind of stuck. We got land that we can, you know, we can raise a few goats on it, but we can't do much else with it. And England was down to about 10% forest by the 1400s. So they went to Poland, actually, to get the mast for their ships, and then they discovered the white pine. And so, you know, we've got masts for our ships now. So that was, and one of the first efforts to preserve our forests was done by the British. I know if you've ever heard them say they put the king's mark on any white pine that was 2 feet or more in diameter. At any rate, once you get into the settlement period of 1780s, 1790s, early 1800s, basically there were nothing would stop you from cutting down every tree that was in your path. Now, they observed some changes that made that weren't very, um, you know, environmentally damaging. One was that stream flow would change. A lot of these dams that they'd created for sawmills and grist mills, well, the water flow wasn't as steady, because trees hold an enormous amount of water, they release it steady. They also mentioned that certain streams, you know, they clear cut all the way up to the original source, and then there was a cloud burst, and all of a sudden they got a gully. So that was one of the things they observed early on. Well, in the process, there were no game laws. There was nothing that would stop you from shooting anything that had 4 feet, and you could hunt 365 days of the year. So, of course, one of the primary targets were the predators. There was the wolves, and the mountain lions, and the bears. And there was actually a bounty, for some reason, on wolves in particular. They wanted to get rid of wolves, you know, as fast as possible. You would think they would have put a bounty on mountain lions, because I think mountain lions would do just as much damage as a wolf would. But I didn't come across any evidence of that. So those 3 animals, along with the white-tailed deer and a variety of others, they were gone, you know, before the Civil War. The one animal that's an exception, and this is something that, when I first read this, I said, this doesn't sound right. And beavers were actually gone from most of New York State by 1700. And that was because the impact of the beaver trade. You know, the pelts were so valuable that basically Native Americans were going farther and farther, and they were actually, the Iroquois actually, you know, went to war with neighboring tribes so they could get, you know, their beaver grounds. Then you also had the, you know, settlers that came in, and the frontiersmen, they came out as well. You know, beaver pelts brought in a lot of money. Well, anytime you are trying to take any one thing above and beyond its capacity to repopulate. So beavers were gone very early. So this process would continue on of right up into the Civil War period, up to about 1870, of eliminating the forest. And there weren't, also, as far as I know, there weren't any kind of restrictions as far as the environment or game laws as well. Now, one of the other things that was a surprise, I had kind of assumed that Tioga County's population, you know, was say a few hundred in the 1790s, and then, you know, and then it expanded on a gradual basis right up until, you know, when I was working on Seasons of Change. The county's population was like around 52,000. But that was, boy, but I got water here. But that wasn't the case. When you get up into 1870, the population of the county is 33,000 something. And one of the things that's really helpful for tracking historical trends is that New York State had a census right up until 1925. The 1925 census was really helpful for me because that was about the peak of our diversity as far as Tioga County was concerned, you know, and mostly it was all these immigrant farmers. But 1875 rolls around and the population drops about 600. And every 5 years, the county's population would drop. And this went on for 50 years until you hit about 25,000 in 1920. So, why was this happening? And that could be the topic for a whole nother discussion. You know, once again, another thread that you can explore. But basically, the primary reasons were that we had taken all the farmland that was from the old growth forest. So, you know, a lot of the really prime land was gone. And then you had all this farmland that opened up in the Midwest and the Far West. And then rail transport was established. So your transportation rates were much lower. So commodity prices dropped from 1870 right up into 1900. There was an article from 1896 comparing the price of oats, the price of corn, butter, potatoes. In some cases, it was like 60% less.
Wow.
So, what do you hear from dairy farmers today? I'm not getting much more from my milk than I did 20 years ago, and all of my expenses are higher. So the farms off in the hills basically could no longer compete. And, young people that could read into the future said, I don't see a life for myself on this farm. We're just barely getting by. And if I take over from the family farm, that's probably what's gonna happen to me, if not worse. So, young people started leaving, early on. And by the 1880s, farmland is being abandoned. By the 1890s, whole farms are being abandoned. People are just walking away from them. Nobody wants them anymore. They can't support themselves. Well, if you're an environmentalist and a naturalist, guess what? Any of you that have tried to keep a hedgerow trimmed up, or tried to keep the goldenrod and the briars out of a pasture when the cows are no longer out there, nature returns. And so this basically is what started to take place. We were down to about 20% forest in 1870. And there may have been some periods of time where that stabilized, but from that point on, right up until now, we're up to about 75%. And you can find all kinds of land that's basically in transition to forest as well. So, now that the forest is returned, and along with that, by the time you get in the late 1800s, there's an environmental movement that, Theodore Roosevelt in particular, John Muir, John Burroughs, these people were saying, we should be more careful with our trees, we should be more careful with our forests. I think one of the things that woke people up was when the passenger pigeon disappeared. You read accounts of passenger pigeons, and I'm sure they were in Tioga County. They say that the sky would be black with them when they were migrating. And, people would take a shotgun, you could kill 50 or 60 of them at once, they said the branches of the trees would break, from the weight of these birds. So, all these animals that had been eliminated earlier, they start to return. The first one is the white-tailed deer. So, this is from the Weagle Gazette, June 20th of 1907. The headline was, "An Unusual Sight." And this actually happened up where I live. I live between Newark Valley and Berkshire. And they talked about people on a train. They were riding on the Lehigh Valley. And they saw a doe with two fawns running along the railroad tracks. And it was a sensation. It was as sensational as the moose coming through here 20-some years ago. And then, as far as, this is where you really want to reach out to somebody and thank them as far as, history is concerned. They said the last time a deer had been seen in Tioga County was 1847. And they gave the particulars. It was a buck deer that got driven into the Susquehanna River by some dogs, swimming down the river. A couple people saw it, and one of them took a gun and shot it. And then another person went out in a boat, finished the deer off. This is perfectly legal. Dressed the carcass. And so for a period of 60 years, there were no white-tailed deer in Tioga County. And that's something I can say with a great deal of certainty. So the next quadruped that shows up is a black bear. And this is an article from 1917. They saw one 2 miles north of Smithboro on Ross Hill. And the other thing that was interesting about that is that, we're probably pretty certain now that there was a bear that showed up in 1915, but when it was reported, nobody believed it. They just said, you're you're seeing things, it was probably a big black shaggy dog. And it was just totally dismissed. But the second time around, well, maybe, I guess that's the real thing. So bears have been here for over 100 years. I actually did see one in my backyard, went to my bird feeder in the spring. That's a common thing that happens. The other thing now, coyotes. You were talking about coyotes earlier. Coyotes were not native to the southern tier. Coyotes and wolves don't mix. So if you have a wolf population, they're big and bad enough, the coyotes have to, stay in a different area. But with the wolves gone, coyotes have filled this niche. Now exactly where they came from, I'm not entirely sure, but the first report that shows up in the Owego Gazette is that a Spencer hunter kills, he referred to it as a prairie wolf. He was a Finnish farmer, and so he remembers him seeing him out, in the Plain States, and that was in West Danby. So if they were in West Danby, chances are we had coyotes in Tioga County, but the actual report didn't come along until later.
What year was that?
That was 1920. And then as far as forest history is concerned, I do want to mention something about the chestnut, because the chestnut tree was also one of the most valuable trees in North America, just from a variety of reasons. And it was one of the things that really helped intensify the public's knowledge and concern for invasive species. It came in from China, I think, in the Brooklyn Botanical Arboretum, and then it basically just spread like a cancer. And so it hit Tioga County in the 1920s. Next animal that shows up is the beaver, and that shows up in Richford, and that creates another sensation. It's on the front page of the papers. And according to the news accounts, there's like 1,000 people that show up to watch this beaver dam and these beavers at work. And the newspaper says, if you molest a beaver, you'll get heavily fined or imprisoned. It's like that's how severe the laws were. And the farm on which the beaver shows up, this farmer was pretty enterprising, so he renamed his farm the Beaver Dam Farm, and he went out and started selling hot dogs. Mm-hmm.
When were the beaver?
That was 1927, yeah, for Richford. And then the first report of a coyote in Tioga County proper comes along in 1928. And one of the things that the newspapers said was that we have heard plenty of reports of deer, one or two parties seeing bear, now wolves, coyotes, and soon perhaps we'll have with us a herd of the great American buffalo. I don't think there's any buffalo over it, but that's how Buffalo, New York got its name. And there are people keeping buffalo. Every so often they break out. You have to see a buffalo wandering down the road here every so often. So what happens next? Dear me. Yeah, you're swallow. So deer being a protected species, it starts to increase. Now, I happen to have a New York State game book from 1911. I just happened to look at it before I came. In 1911, you could hunt deer in the Adirondacks. The rest of the state was off limits. And I was surprised that none of the Catskill counties were legal. Now, that may have come along probably soon after. But by the time you get into the 1920s, it appears that most of New York State, there's an open season on white-tailed deer. But not Tioga County, and that's one of the things that, I'd like to try to, find out, why that happened. Because there was an article from 1928 where that was kind of brought up, kind of like the sportsmen of Tioga County, and they were opposed to it at that time along with the farmers. Even though it said there was an open season on the rest of the state. And then 1929, there's an article about 300 Endicott brothers. They shot a 250-pound buck on Wade Hollow Road. They were fined each $108.50. So this is the month after the Depression. That was a lot of money. In 1929. First report of a deer hitting a vehicle, 1931. So there may have been some other accidents, but that's the first one that makes the papers. And then once the Depression hits, New York State acquires thousands of acres of land throughout New York State, including Tioga County. And of course, once that happens, this helps increase the amount of land that gets returned to forest. So the discussion relating to hunting season starts to get more and more heated and more of a topic of interest and discussion through the 1930s. And so as late as 1935, the dairymen were opposed to an open season. The reasons that they were opposed, a lot of them enjoyed seeing the deer. They still hadn't done that much damage to the crops, and they were more concerned about the damage the hunters would do when they got on their property. So, all right, let's look at the balance scale here. And then now, one of the things that came along with this is that the farmers in Appalachian, they were interested in having a deer season down there because hunters are coming on our land and driving the deer into Pennsylvania where they could hunt them. So that was one of the things they were concerned about. And then a couple other things to mention. There are some very credible reports of mountain lions or panthers in the 1930s. And I've talked to numerous people that say they have seen mountain lions. So this is kind of like a controversial topic of, have they been brought in to reduce the deer population? Have these escaped from people's, private zoos? I'm not entirely sure, but there were reports from the mid-30s of people that said they either saw a cat-like animal that was very large, or they had dogs that came back and looked like they'd been lacerated by something that was, very large. And then the other environmental thing that's worth mentioning, March 28, 1935, this was one of the biggest dust storms to hit the Plain States during the Dust Bowl years. And they saw the dust of Kansas and Colorado in Tioga County. So that was another an environmental piece of news, to let people in Tioga County know what was going on, a couple thousand miles away. So finally we get up to about 1940, and there's an article about deer destroyed $1,000 worth of rare shrubs. So now the population is getting up to the point, all right, we're going to have an open season. So we can't let the population just continue breeding without slowing them down. There was a person that I don't have a particular name, but there's still a lot of people that are opposed to it. That just the thought of killing deer, especially when they'd seen them for so long and they were probably feeding them. So this one letter to the Gazette says, well, it is over, the guns are stilled. There is a solemn hush over the valley now. The deer are dead. It is as though one had just returned from the mass funeral of one's neighbors. And then this continues on. It says, but now, during this unholy week, we have been forced to see them come and to feel that we have betrayed them. There have been trails of blood across their sanctuary. Wild-eyed, they have been driven and cornered in agony in a desperate attempt to save their lives, which they never had a chance of saving. And we were helpless to save them from the unbridled greed and lust for killing of our own kind. Boy. And I'm sure there were other people in Tioga County that felt the same way. So, kind of tapping into this type of feeling that people had for white-tailed deer that was still so strong, and the quality of the writing in the newspapers from that period was really superior. There's no byline for this. I don't know who is responsible for this, but in 1941, some writer for the Gazette decides that he's going to try to talk about this whole phenomenon from the viewpoint of the deer. And so we have Bud, who is described as a mendacious man. He's kind of walking out into the fields and the forests, and he has this kind of epiphany of, I think nature is communicating with me. I wonder if there's anything out there that can actually, talk to me and, say exactly how they feel. And so all of a sudden, Bucky, a brawny buck, who has the answer, shows up, and he says, "Heard what you said, Mr. Wise Guy, about the possible existence of an idiom exclusively confined to the animal kingdom. After listening to the conglomerate gab you humans use every day, we dumb clucks decided unanimously that such indiscriminate talk is what we need none of." And he was a representative of the IODD, the Independent Order of Dependent Deer. And this would go on for about 6 or 7 years. And so, there's a report, from October of 1941, and Bucky says that he's just been voted the president of his amalgamation, and he says, "Sure, it may be my last. I guess we know that ballots and bullets are both deadly." And then for December of 1942, Bucky returns, and he makes a comment about, here we are with another hunting season, but probably all the good shots are in the service. They're in the, they've been conscripted, so he makes, and he said, something about, why don't you put a price support on venison the way you do have it on all the other meats that are out there. And to help the war effort, he's going to tell Bud where some of the scrap piles exist, off in the woods. And then 1943 was the first year you could shoot doe. And now Bucky's already gone. Now the way it's described is that he's trying to defend his womenfolk, and basically goes into a high state of stress and probably has a heart attack.
You had too many women to watch.
And then 1944, you have message from Bucky Jr. And so this goes, and I was looking through my notes, and there was actually some that went up into in 1946 and 1947. So what has happened since the Second World War is a lot better known. Turkeys are one of the things that were introduced. So I'm sure they would have shown up on their own at some point, but there was a population in Western New York, and the DEC at that day in the early 50s, they went ahead and grabbed a bunch of turkeys and then reintroduced them. And as you know, they do very well. And I don't think they really do much as far as any kind of environmental damage of any sort. So, you see them out in the fields, and they're picking through the cornfields and the manure that's out there, and, and they're, people that I've talked to, they're hunters, say they're tough to bag. They're very leery. It's like the domestic turkey is probably about as far from the wild turkey as you can get. So that was one of the things when I was thinking about biodiversity. Now, in recent years, people have told me that there's bobcats that have shown up, fishers, and porcupines. Now, I've never seen one, but I've been told that, here's just something, because we've got enough forest, and I imagine they're probably, I don't know if they're protected or not necessarily. Yeah, but, there's probably not that much reason for someone to, want to, shoot them anyway unless they're, yeah. So, that kind of covers, what's happened, environmentally, in particular for the white-tailed deer. Any questions? Yes?
So the turkey thing, so how far away were turkeys native? Were you saying like they were native to like this part of the New York State prior to 1870s, or I was just confused?
I would imagine that, I think there was probably different species, but I think they were really widespread throughout North America. I think they even have them down in Mexico. There's a type of wild turkey that's down there. And that would have been one of the birds that, as you cut down the forest, just getting rid of the environment alone is gonna reduce the numbers, besides the fact that there was no restrictions until you get in the late 1800s as far as hunting was concerned. But I think what I've read was that in the early 50s, they wanted to speed up the process of them, coming into the southern tier, so they went to western New York, captured a bunch of them, and introduced a flock into the southern tier somewhere. Yes?
Were minks indigenous to this area? I
Yeah.
had read something about a mink farm in Appalachian, and some of them, I don't know, ran off and became, native to the area, but I didn't know if they were.
There's silver foxes in that place.
Oh, yeah, they have
The
a
Glen
Glen.
farm.
Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, there's like Chattel.
I used to go over there.
Yeah.
But I think all the foxes, the gray fox, the red fox, and mink, I'm assuming were native to North America. But there have been, efforts at times to raise them, for the fur, including minks.
Yeah.
Well, we have deer farms too.
Yeah.
Mhm.
still one of those.
Yes.
Why have deer decreased in this area in the last few years?
That's a good point. I've brought that question up to a variety of people, hunters, who definitely would know for sure, and some of you that hunt, can chime in. It seems to vary. There are particular areas where deer seem to be no less than they were for the last 5 or 10 years, and then other areas where all of a sudden you can't hardly see any of them. So they seem to migrate, from one place to another. And I know that the number of deer that they allow you to shoot from one year to the next can change. Also, the number of tags that actually get retrieved can change from one year to the next. And then, I think farmers can get a nuisance permit, can't they?
Yes.
Yeah. So, I think I don't think there's been any stop, relating to that, if a farmer feels he's got deer that are really damaging his crops.
They ate the rhododendrons though.
Do they eat rhododendrons?
Oh,
Okay.
They'll eat anything.
House, they've eaten every one of them, we have them all over the place.
They don't like daffodils.
No?
Poisonous, I think.
Yeah, they don't like
They
daffodils.
I think,
Yes.
this is just so
Jill-
rich. I
Jill
just
is
think,
great.
I heard about you talking a week ago and I missed it.
Jill
I
has a
was
thing
like, I wanna find
in
a
her
start.
Oh, imagine, yeah.
I guess I have two questions, or
Yeah.
one question would be, of the books on the table, are any of those books speak to this topic?
Yeah, that's right.
more than
It'll be
they're
there
further?
further.
Are those books
Yeah,
This
yeah,
was
From
from American Heritage, this was from 1970.
yeah, I
It
know.
says
it'll
the
be-
return of the white-tailed deer.
So that's harder to get my hands on.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then, The Nature of New York, this is an environmental history of New York specifically. And then I love this cover, Nature Wars, the incredible story of how wildlife comebacks turn backyards into battlegrounds. And, one other thing that's worth mentioning, if someone could come up with a non-lethal way of reducing the deer population, they would be, they'd get probably the Presidential Medal of Freedom,
Would be
and they would probably
millionaires,
become very wealthy. Because if you look at, for a good long period of time, when I was a librarian, I would get the Ithaca Journal.
Yeah.
By Hugo Heights.
Oh my
And then the
Binghamton
nature preserve.
University. Binghamton University.
And Binghamton University, the same thing. And I remember seeing Audubon magazine, and it was like they had a picture of a deer, but, you know, they had somebody aiming a gun at it. This is odd, because they, when they fence in areas of the forest where the deer can't get in, there's an enormous change in what happens environmentally. And a lot of what they do is damaging to bird populations. So, you know, so that was interesting to see the Audubon Club, you know, coming out in favor of, you know, reducing white-tailed deer.
Well, Cayuga Heights though is bad in Ithaca with the deer. It really is. I mean, half of them have collars on so they can track them around.
Oh, really? Oh, I didn't know
Yeah,
you
and
did
it's,
that.
and it's funny because, I mean, it's sort of ironic, but you wonder why PETA isn't in there to complain, because the deer bends over and it whacks them in the back of the head. They sit up and it goes back down again, and,
Only with these collars?
yeah, to track them and stuff. It's really, I mean,
Yeah, they also
yeah,
have them in their ears.
yeah, I mean, it's, and my friend had one who used, whenever the bird feeder got empty, it would bang on the kitchen window. Get out here.
Yeah, I've heard of people, they watch it, you know,
Yeah.
deer giving birth to fawns in their backyard.
I know, it's
Oh, yeah.
just crazy.
Yeah.
Some areas.
Of course, that's part of the problem.
Really become a nuisance.
Not necessarily.
Well, I mean, not only do they feed
Intentionally,
them
but-
intentionally, but unintentionally,
Yeah,
they
yeah.
every last thing
Right.
How
there
many
is,
are up on Doug Martin?
you know, but it's just outrageous.
Well,
Now,
there's good food up
Lots
there.
of them. There's lots
one of the
them.
things I would like to do at some point is, you know, put this into a, you know, kind of like an article that you could, you know, that you could read, but right now, you know, a lot of this was on the website for the North Valley Historical Society, and we're in the process of revamping the website, so I'm not entirely sure if, you know, if it's still available, but I went through and I did excerpts going back to the early 1800s from these histories, you know, written in the late 1800s. And then a lot of the stuff, you know, from 1907 right up into the 1940s, I just had excerpts from the newspaper. So if you want to find out what Bucky the Deer was telling the public in the 1940s, you know, I think you could type in stories from the natural world. And I think that was the link that's what it brought up before. But I can't guarantee that would work now, but maybe I can get your contact information, I could, you know, if I'm sure, you know, it's still available, I could, you know, that way, if you're interested in, you know, pursuing this, one of the things, you know, when I'm reading, reports from DEC or Cornell about wildlife, a lot of this stuff from prior to World War II, they don't know, because nobody was doing reports of that sort, or they were very minimal. And so nobody's really, because, you know, they say, well, the coyote population has been increasing, you know, over the last 30 or 40 years. Well, no, it's been increasing over the last, well, it's almost 100 years, because the first coyote shows up in 1920 in West Danby. So, you know, a lot of the people, even the professionals, because they haven't looked at, you know, what's been in newspapers accounts, because they don't have anything in their DEC reports or environmental reports, you know, relating to that. So, you know, that's a pitch for newspapers. You know, print. You know, try to buy a newspaper. Keep print journalism alive.
Kids can't afford it.
Yeah, that's
It was just by accident.
Were you searching, searching the microphone?
Well, at the time, the bound volumes were still available. They hadn't acidified to the point where you couldn't just pull out, you know, a volume from 1917 and then just go page by page. Because now it's on microfilm and it's like, you know, even if you're young, it's tough on your eyes, let alone my eyes. You know, but right now, that's the only way you can access the stuff. But as I was going through, you know, I made my own index to the Owego Gazette, going back to the 1830s, right through the 1940s. Because I realized, besides reading about Jewish merchants and Greek restaurant owners and Polish farmers and the Ku Klux Klan, for instance, you know, here's all this wildlife information, you know, and then right around the turn of the century, you know, Tioga County realized, we're in a state of crisis. We're gonna disappear. We've been losing population for 25 years. What's gonna stop it? So they actually came up with a Boom the Town campaign, trying to convince people, that this is an important place to live and you shouldn't give up. But, there's that song from World War, how do you keep them down on the farm after they've seen parade? Which is very true, but people have been leaving the farm. I mean, even before the Civil War, the young people were leaving the farms in New England. So this is a process that's been going on for quite some time. Now, you said the space satellite is out there?
Oh, yeah, 816.
816? She had mentioned to me that the space station is supposed to pass overhead. For any of you who wanna run outside and see if you can
It
get
does that a lot.
Does it?
Yeah, because the guy on Channel 12 News
Oh, he
Our
reports
business.
it?
Yeah.
talks about it all the time, so if you go
How
out,
often does it go?
which is really
Every
cool, I
day?
think he's good about it. And if there's
Yeah,
stars,
now they do some-
stars or
No.
planets to go out and look at, he tells you.
Uh-huh.
Just looks like
Ed,
Get you back
Yeah.
outside.
what about the cougar reports of recent years? I mean, we're told that they're not here, but. people see
Yeah,
them.
The what?
yeah, there was wasn't there a farmer in Appalachian that had a deer that was just, I saw pictures of it, and it was just severely lacerated, like, this looks like it was done by a large cat-like animal.
What about Bob?
Well, there's lots of people that will disagree with you, that's all I can say, I don't know one way or another.
My nephews have, cameras out in the fields and
Mm.
woods, and they have taken pictures of, what's the one with the black tail, the cat?
Panther?
It's,
Was like what's some type of bobcat?
yeah, bobcat.
No, there's
Yeah,
bobcats around.
yeah.
Yeah, I think I
Pictures
did.
of them.
Yeah, bobcats around.
The state's been putting them in too.
Oh, bobcats? Oh, they've introduced
Like,
it? Ah,
For what? Just out of curiosity, why do they want to do that?
there was an article on the wall here
Oh,
a few
okay.
years ago.
yeah.
If you see bobcats, please report them.
Mm.
And they've been putting them in.
Wow.
But why? I wonder.
Because they got pretty black tails.
Was it take down the deer? Was it, is it because take down the deer to get rid of the deer?
Yeah, they'll take the fawn.
Yeah, but
They'll
the
take a
coyotes
fawn.
are doing that.
Yeah,
so-
the coyotes, yeah, because
Mhm.
the last year that Lyman did hand, in one field, he found 7 carcasses of the fawns.
Oh, really?
God.
Yeah,
Probably across the road from my house, huh?
well, somewhere, well,
No, I-
then
but I
I
can-
live in
I can
Woodsville.
hear
When they assuming it's coyotes that have done it
Yeah,
probably?
yeah,
Uh-huh.
because you can hear them at night, these two.
Yeah.
Oh, you can hear the coyotes, and it's not one or two, it's a whole, they're out there howling and screaming.
See, that's one of the things that makes me skeptical about mountain lions, is, the times that I've gone out in the woods, I've never seen any, lion tracks. I mean, they could hide if they want, but, they're not gonna cover up their track, and also, they have like a really high-pitched, scream, and I've never heard one of those. I've heard coyotes plenty of times.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Fox.
So those are, two of the things that, make me doubtful about any coyotes being around. Yes.
I guess, mountain lions, I guess, get hit by cars a lot, like in California too, so if there were a lot of
Oh,
mountain
yeah,
lions,
yeah.
they would probably start getting hit by cars. I guess, the coyote thing is just really rich, cause, I like what you referenced that you read about their prairie wolves.
Yeah,
I guess the eastern coyote, they believe, or what I've read, is that they're a mix between the Ontario wolf from Canada and the western coyote, so that's why they're so much bigger and wolf-like in the niche they feel is more like a wolf-like niche. than
yeah, I think
coyotes.
there was a program not too long ago, because people were referencing it, when I talked about this topic at the Sierra Club, is that, I had read that the eastern coyote has wolf DNA, and that some people actually call them coy wolves, because they're actually a hybrid.
Yeah, right.
National
So they're
Geographic.
very unique to
Oh,
this area.
really?
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
they called them coy wolves.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Said the DNA was similar.
Yeah, yeah.
In Pennsylvania, they say we don't have mountain lions or bobcats, but I think we do. I've seen them hiking. We have to be way.
I mean, there's no reason why they couldn't start expanding, because, we've got so much more
We'll talk about
land
this Friday.
that's turned into forest,
We'll talk
and
about
if the
this Friday
environment is
morning.
there, if we know that they're out west, so,
Is the food source, they're gonna be there.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I'm ready for some goodies.
Yeah.